They glanced at her ID with suspicion, whispering behind the door, then called for security. This all happened before they even realized that the elderly woman standing quietly before them was none other than the founder and CEO of the bank where they worked, a person whose word alone could end their careers in an instant. Evelyn was a 68-year-old black woman, the CEO and founder of Carter Trust Bank, a large financial institution she had built from scratch. In her youth, she endured difficult times, witnessing widespread injustice and racial discrimination in the urban streets. This experience fueled Evelyn's desire to create a different kind of bank, one where every customer, regardless of age, race, or gender, would be treated with respect and fairness. Her bank wasn't just a place for financial transactions, but a symbol of trust, equality, and the human values she cherished. But now, in the silence of this office, Evelyn felt those very values were being questioned. Was Carter Trust Bank, the labor of love she had carefully nurtured, still truly committed to equality? Or had it become nothing more than pretty words on paper, empty promises that no one bothered to verify? Lately, Evelyn had begun hearing worried whispers from a few loyal customers. Some elderly black clients felt overlooked when they entered certain branches, small stories that repeated too often to be ignored. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, but Evelyn had enough experience to know. Sometimes the greatest injustices hide in the smallest, seemingly insignificant actions. Am I too old now, unable to see the problems that exist within the very house I built? Evelyn wondered aloud with a heavy sigh. She stood up, slowly walked to the window, and gazed down at the streets below, where small figures hurried on their way to their own lives. Evelyn knew that, as a leader, it would be easy to let the shiny reports lull her into believing everything was fine. But the strong intuition of someone who had lived through much in her life was warning her that something was terribly wrong in her bank. Evelyn turned and looked at the old photo hanging on the wall of her office. It was from the grand opening day of Carter Trust Bank. She stood there with a beaming smile, holding a golden pair of scissors, ready to cut the ribbon. All the hopes and strong commitments from that day now served as a reminder of the responsibility she had to the promises she had made to the community. No, Evelyn told herself firmly. I can't live with these vague doubts. I need the truth, no matter how painful it may be. In that moment, Evelyn made a bold decision. To discover the truth, she couldn't rely on reports, impersonal numbers, or abstract promises. Evelyn herself would have to become the witness, the customer, a regular black woman like any other client stepping into Carter Trust Bank. It was time to learn the truth with her own eyes, her own ears, and her own senses. This was a responsibility she couldn't escape, a responsibility that went far beyond the successes she had achieved in the past. Evelyn picked up the phone, her eyes shining with determination. Tomorrow, I'll go check for myself. And if there's anything that goes against the values I believe in, I swear I will never allow it to exist under this roof of Carter Trust. The darkness outside still hung over everything with a false peace, but within Evelyn, a storm of fierce determination was beginning to rise. The next morning came faster than Evelyn had expected. The sun filtered through the window, waking her from a short nap filled with unfinished dreams. Evelyn woke up with a mix of excitement and anxiety, emotions that were foreign to someone as steady as she was. But today was different, because she knew that what she was about to do could change so much. Not just for her, but for the thousands of people who had placed their trust in Carter Trust. Evelyn slowly stood up, examining herself in the mirror as if to ensure that the person looking back was ordinary enough, simple enough, so that no one would recognize her true identity. She chose an old cream-colored sweater, simple jeans, and a pair of white sneakers. Nothing like the powerful CEO she usually was. The worn brown handbag she selected added a touch to the outfit, with no jewelry or expensive accessories to give away the true identity of this woman. Before leaving, Evelyn took a deep breath and took one last look around her familiar office. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness thinking about all the years she had fought, built, and nurtured this bank. But today, she was no longer CEO Evelyn Carter. She was simply an elderly black woman with a fragile hope of being treated fairly. Around 10 a.m., Evelyn parked at the lot of the Carter Trust branch in downtown Indianapolis, the very place where she had cut the ribbon 3 years ago. The modern, clean building still looked the same as she remembered, but today, it felt strangely foreign to her. Evelyn walked through the door with a slight unease in her heart. From the very first moment, she sensed an unusually cold atmosphere. None of the staff greeted her with a friendly glance, though they warmly welcomed other customers. She approached the teller counter and faced a young woman, her name tag clearly reading, Megan Richards, Teller. Evelyn gave a soft smile, but in return, Megan only gave her a cold, indifferent look, quickly glancing past her as if she were invisible. "What do you want?" Megan asked curtly, her gaze still fixed on the computer screen, her voice lacking any warmth or politeness. "I'd like to withdraw $5,000 from my personal account," Evelyn responded softly, trying to keep her voice calm. Megan looked up, eyeing Evelyn with suspicion. Her sharp blue eyes scanned her, as if assessing whether the elderly woman in front of her could actually possess the amount she had just mentioned. "Fill out this form." Megan slid a piece of paper toward Evelyn, her voice noticeably cold. Evelyn took the pen and slowly filled out the personal details, feeling the weight of Megan's scrutinizing gaze on her every movement. When she pushed the form back and handed over her ID, Megan furrowed her brows, glancing at the information with a meticulous eye, then frowned in apparent discomfort. "Wait a moment," Megan quickly said, standing up from her seat and heading toward the manager's office. Evelyn watched her go, a deep sense of worry rising within her. Behind the frosted glass door, branch manager Robert Hudson sat neatly behind a polished wooden desk. Robert was a man in his early 40s, with neatly combed graying hair, always well-dressed and confident. He had a stable career at Carter Trust, but always showed a strong ambition for advancement. He was the one who had shaken Evelyn's hand on the opening day of this branch, with flowery promises of fairness, equality, and serving the community. But beneath that polished exterior, Robert harbored clear, unspoken prejudices, a truth Evelyn had never noticed before. Megan entered Robert's office and placed Evelyn's paperwork on his desk. "The customer out there wants to withdraw $5,000, Megan murmured, her face full of doubt. "She doesn't look like someone who would have that much in an account." Robert took the paperwork, scrutinizing Evelyn's ID, his eyes narrowing slightly before he smirked. He looked up at Megan with a serious expression, but one that couldn't hide a subtle, silent agreement. "All right, Megan, let her wait a little longer. I'll go see her soon." Evelyn remained standing outside, trying to maintain her composure even as waves of unease stirred inside her. Megan's cold stare, the strange attitude of Robert behind the glass door, it all seemed to confirm the doubts she had felt earlier. But Evelyn was determined not to back down. She knew that she was standing on the threshold of the truth, and just one more step would reveal everything that was happening under the roof of Carter Trust. And no matter how painful the truth might be, Evelyn would face it, because this was not just her personal story, but a responsibility to the thousands of customers who had placed their trust in her bank. Evelyn stood silently at the counter, feeling each heavy beat of her heart in her chest. The moments of waiting seemed endless. Her gaze drifted gently over the familiar setting of the Carter Trust Bank branch in Indianapolis, a place where, 3 years ago, she had stood amidst the flashbulbs and resounding applause during the grand opening. But now, that familiar scene felt colder, more distant than ever. Finally, the glass door behind the counter swung open. Megan stepped back in, followed by Robert Hudson, the tall and confident branch manager. Robert slowly approached, observing Evelyn discreetly, though with a clear hint of scrutiny. He adjusted his purple-striped tie on his perfectly white shirt and forced a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter. I'm Robert Hudson, the branch manager here. Megan mentioned you wanted to withdraw a large sum of cash. Is that correct?" His voice was courteous, yet laced with suspicion. Evelyn felt it clearly. She responded softly, trying to hide the emotions bubbling inside her. "Yes, that's correct. I'd like to withdraw $5,000 from my personal account. I've filled out all the paperwork and provided my ID to Megan." Robert took Evelyn's documents and briefly glanced at her ID before pausing, as if verifying something. "I see." He nodded slowly, though his face remained tense. "Mrs. Carter, I hope you understand. But for security reasons, we need to verify a few details before proceeding with the transaction." Evelyn looked up at Robert, a slight unease stirring inside her. What he had just said was highly unusual. She knew the procedures of her own bank well. A small withdrawal like this, with the proper documentation, had never required such complicated steps. "Excuse me," Evelyn kept her voice steady, "but I don't think withdrawing this amount should require such verification. Is there some serious issue here?" Robert tilted his head slightly, glancing at Megan as if exchanging an unspoken message, before turning back to Evelyn with a smile that wasn't quite sincere. "Oh, nothing serious. It's just some extra security measures. Recently, we've had to be more cautious with certain unusual transactions." $5,000 is unusual?" Evelyn responded, her gaze calm but resolute. "Not exactly." Robert smirked slightly, "but we have a responsibility to ensure everything is secure." In that moment, Evelyn saw a flash of prejudice in Robert's eyes. He didn't care about security as he claimed. The only thing that mattered to him was whether the elderly black woman standing before him actually had the money she wanted to withdraw. Before Evelyn could respond, Robert continued, his tone shifting subtly from polite to firm. "If you don't mind, we'll need a bit more information. Could you please provide your occupation and the reason for this withdrawal?" Evelyn felt a surge of anger rising in her chest. It had been a long time since she had experienced this feeling, being belittled, unjustly doubted as she was now. "I'm a customer of this bank," Evelyn answered calmly, but with enough clarity that a few nearby customers turned to look. "And I don't think withdrawing my own money should require a personal investigation like this." Robert seemed taken aback by Evelyn's response but quickly regained his composure. His gaze turned colder, and the smile vanished from his polished face. "Mrs. Carter, this is simply the process we follow for situations like this. If you cannot provide additional information, I'm afraid we won't be able to proceed with this transaction." The atmosphere in the bank grew noticeably tense. A few customers nearby began to pay attention to the exchange, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. Evelyn stared directly into Robert's eyes, and in that moment she knew the answer to the vague doubts she had harbored earlier. They were no longer doubts. They were a harsh truth unfolding before her eyes. Beneath the roof she had proudly built, prejudice and racism still quietly thrived, disguised under the guise of security protocols and safety measures. But Evelyn was not ready to back down, not yet. She took a deep breath, maintaining her calm exterior, and slowly responded, each word clear and deliberate. "I will provide everything you need, but I hope you truly understand what you are doing." Robert looked at Evelyn, his gaze challenging and self-assured, as if he were in full control of the situation. "Of course, Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, a hint of arrogance creeping into his tone. "We always know exactly what we're doing." Evelyn remained silent, but in her heart, she knew that this trial had just entered a new phase, a phase filled with difficulties, but one she had to overcome, because she had made up her mind not to let anyone break the values she had once held dearer than life itself. Evelyn stood silently at the counter, an unmistakable sense of unease rising within her, as Megan's suspicious gaze continued to scrutinize her openly. The bank, once bright and modern, now felt cold, making Evelyn feel like a stranger in the very place she had built with her own hands. "I've given you all the necessary documents," Evelyn gently reminded her, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. Megan remained silent for a few seconds, then, unexpectedly, turned her attention back to Evelyn's ID. The young woman furrowed her brows, her cold blue eyes reflecting deep suspicion that she didn't even attempt to hide. "Wait a minute," Megan said curtly, not looking at Evelyn, before suddenly standing up and briskly walking towards the management office, holding Evelyn's documents. Megan's hurried footsteps echoed, as if sending a message to those around her that something suspicious was going on. Evelyn stood alone at the counter, keenly aware of a few customers discreetly glancing in her direction. An elderly black woman, simply dressed, standing quietly and awkwardly at the counter. This was exactly the image Evelyn had never imagined she would have to experience in her own bank, Carter Trust. Inside the management office, Megan placed the documents on Robert's desk with a tense attitude. "I think there's something off about her," Megan said in a low but firm voice, her gaze resolute. "The amount she wants to withdraw is way too large for someone who looks like her. I don't feel comfortable processing this transaction." Robert raised an eyebrow, his gaze briefly serious but also tinged with a silent understanding. As a longtime manager, Robert was adept at presenting himself as a stickler for policy, but he was no stranger to the biases quietly lurking within himself. To him, an elderly black woman dressed simply and modestly like Evelyn could hardly be trusted with a large account without some hidden agenda. "You did the right thing, Megan," Robert lowered his voice. "We need to be very careful with cases like this. Let me handle it." While Megan and Robert exchanged words, Evelyn stood outside, her emotions a mixture of confusion and deep disappointment. She realized that the very people she had hired, trained, and trusted, people like Robert and Megan, were now betraying the very basic values that Carter Trust represented. Robert walked out of the office, his demeanor now cold and distant. He approached Evelyn, his expression stern, yet not hiding a subtle, underlying judgment. "Miss Carter, I'm afraid we can't verify your transaction just yet. Please wait a moment while we recheck the information." "Why can't you verify it?" Evelyn asked, surprised, her voice wavering slightly but full of resolve. "I've provided all the necessary documents, haven't I?" Robert sighed, as if explaining something painfully obvious. "We need to verify transactions that seem suspicious. It's standard procedure at our bank, I hope you understand." Evelyn felt her anger rising within her chest. She wasn't angry about the wait, but about the covert discrimination masked behind Robert's polite demeanor. But Evelyn held herself in check, maintaining her composure, and gently asked again, "What makes my transaction so suspicious?" Robert hesitated slightly at Evelyn's direct question. He hadn't expected this simple, modest woman to be bold enough to challenge him with such an uncomfortable question. But quickly, he regained his usual calm demeanor. We have to do this to protect the interest of our customers. If you truly own this account, you wouldn't mind waiting a little longer for a thorough verification. The air in the bank seemed to freeze with the invisible tension. A few nearby customers exchanged subtle glances, sensing that something was amiss. Evelyn looked directly into Robert's eyes, a sharp gaze filled with disappointment. In that moment, she understood that this wasn't just a minor misunderstanding. This was the exact line between principles and discrimination, a line Robert and Megan had crossed long ago without even realizing it. "I'll wait," Evelyn replied slowly, her voice resolute. "But I hope you truly understand what you're doing." Robert remained silent, responding to Evelyn with a haughty glance that silently affirmed his absolute authority. He turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing alone once more in the very bank she had built, among people who were slowly forgetting the values she had originally instilled. In Evelyn's heart, the resolve to uncover the truth had never been clearer. She would not allow these biases to continue, no matter the cost. The tense silence had just settled in the room when Evelyn clearly heard the sound of firm footsteps approaching from behind the counter. She looked up, her gaze meeting that of Robert Hudson, the branch manager, who was walking toward her with his familiar polite demeanor, but this time with a completely different air about him. Robert moved slowly, each step radiating control and confidence, but his eyes no longer held the warm friendliness they once had. Instead, they were cold and scrutinizing, making Evelyn feel as though she were a stranger, suspicious in his eyes. "Apologies for keeping you waiting, Mrs. Carter," Robert began, his tone polite, but Evelyn could easily sense the insincerity behind his courteous words. "We had to review some important details regarding your account." "Important details?" Evelyn calmly replied, trying to mask the deep disappointment rising within her. "Mr. Hudson, exactly what are you suspecting?" Robert raised an eyebrow, appearing surprised by Evelyn's straightforwardness, but quickly he regained his composure, offering a forced smile. "Oh, no, please don't misunderstand me. We have no suspicions at all. We just want to ensure the absolute security of every transaction here. Could you kindly provide me with a bit more information regarding the source of the funds you wish to withdraw?" Evelyn could feel the offense in each of Robert's words. She, the one who had laid down the bank's principles, knew well that there was no procedure requiring a customer to provide such information when withdrawing a small sum. What Robert had just done went beyond what she could have imagined. It wasn't about security protocols, but about deep-seated suspicion, stemming from the image of an elderly, modest black woman standing before him. "Mr. Hudson," Evelyn spoke, her voice still calm but her eyes turning steely, "I have followed all the proper procedures and provided the necessary documentation. Why should I explain the origin of my own funds when my identity has already been clearly verified?" Robert smirked slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before quickly hiding it. "Mrs. Carter, it's the procedure, especially for transactions that seem unusual." "Unusual in what way?" Evelyn shot back, not giving Robert a chance to evade further. Robert paused for a few seconds, perhaps taken aback by Evelyn's firmness. But he was used to controlling situations in his own way, and calmly replied, "Please understand, we're simply doing our job. A woman of your age, dressed modestly, suddenly coming here to withdraw such a large sum. It's only natural that we must exercise caution." Robert's words left Evelyn momentarily stunned. These were not just insults, they revealed the deep biases that quietly existed within him and his staff. Evelyn could clearly see that standing before her now was not the polite manager who had once pleased her on opening day, but a completely different person. Someone ready to judge a customer based solely on their appearance. Perhaps I need to remind you that Carter Trust Bank has always committed to equality and respect for all customers, regardless of age or race, Evelyn said, her voice calm but carrying a heavy weight. I don't believe I've done anything to warrant this treatment. Robert looked momentarily flustered at Evelyn's words, but quickly regained his composure. He wasn't about to back down, not from an elderly woman he thought was no longer worth his concern. I'm very sorry if you feel offended, Mrs. Carter, but we must follow security protocols. If you're not willing to cooperate, this transaction may have to be stopped right here. The air in the bank grew heavy, almost suffocating. A few customers began to pay more attention to the tense conversation between Evelyn and the manager. Evelyn looked at Robert, her heart swelling with a mixture of pain and disappointment. Pain because the values she had worked so hard to build were being undermined by someone she trusted. Disappointment because she realized that beneath Robert Hudson's polished and courteous exterior was a man full of prejudice and a lack of basic respect for others. I understand, Evelyn responded softly, her eyes sharpening like never before. Perhaps you've forgotten the true meaning of why Carter Trust Bank was founded. Robert didn't answer, merely offering a faint smile as though Evelyn's words had no value in his eyes. He took the paperwork, turned, and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing alone, quietly in the midst of her pain and fierce resolve. Evelyn knew she had just crossed the final line. She was no longer just another customer at the counter. She was, once again, Evelyn Carter, the person who would have to face and deal with the painful truth that within her very own bank, the equality values she cherished were quietly being shattered by people like Robert Hudson. Evelyn took a deep breath, readying herself for the next steps. She knew it was time for her to make the hardest decision of her life, the decision to change everything. The moment Robert returned to the counter, Evelyn could sense that the situation was far more complicated than she had initially thought. Still wearing his fake polite smile, Robert gently placed Evelyn's paperwork on the desk and began speaking, his words laced with clear suspicion. Mrs. Carter, in order to continue processing this transaction, I need you to provide some additional personal information. Evelyn furrowed her brow slightly, keeping her voice calm. Specifically, what information do you need, Mr. Hudson? Robert tilted his head slightly, his cold eyes scanning Evelyn as if trying to find any sign of unease or discomfort in her demeanor. We need to know your current occupation, your source of income, and the reason why you are withdrawing such a large sum of money in cash today. Evelyn paused for a few seconds, processing the questions that she knew were completely unreasonable and out of the ordinary. She had provided valid identification, and the amount she wished to withdraw was not so large as to warrant such a detailed inquiry. Clearly, the real purpose behind Robert's questions was not security. It was the subtle discrimination trying to force her to give up. I've already made it clear that I'm here to withdraw money from my own legitimate personal account, Evelyn responded slowly, striving to keep her tone even. The information you just requested is completely outside the standard transaction procedures. Robert crossed his arms, smiling faintly as though waiting for the moment when she would lose patience and give up. I'm afraid, Mrs. Carter, but these are the latest regulations at our branch. If you refuse to provide the information, we will have to decline this transaction. Evelyn looked deeply into Robert's eyes, searching for any remnant of conscience in this man, but all she saw was a calculated coldness. She understood that this was Robert's way of trying to make her leave, hurt, helpless, and disappointed. "Mr. Hudson," Evelyn replied with a composed voice, though it clearly carried a deep sense of disappointment. "I wonder if a white man in an expensive suit were standing here before you. Would you ask him the same questions?" Robert flinched slightly at Evelyn's direct question. For a moment, a flash of unease crossed his polite face, but he quickly regained his composure. "Mrs. Carter, please don't misunderstand. We absolutely do not discriminate against customers. This is simply a security protocol." Evelyn shook her head, a quiet sadness flickering in her eyes. She had lived too long, endured too many storms, to be fooled by such shallow explanations. Robert wasn't just insulting her. He was insulting every human value this bank had ever represented. "Security protocol?" Evelyn repeated, her voice lower but sharp. "What protocol allows you to question the character, worth, and dignity of a customer based on their appearance like this?" The tension in the bank had become so thick that other customers had stopped their transactions, quietly observing the exchange between Evelyn and the manager. Robert realized the growing attention and tried to lower his voice carefully, hoping to avoid further scrutiny. "Mrs. Carter, I'm simply doing my duty. If you feel uncomfortable, you're welcome to choose another option. Perhaps come back on another day with all the information we're asking for." Evelyn understood exactly what he was implying. Robert was trying to pressure her into backing down, hoping she would feel embarrassed enough to abandon the transaction and leave without causing further trouble. The subtle discrimination had turned into an unspoken battle between the two of them, and Robert was certain he was winning. But Evelyn was not someone who would easily give up. She took a deep breath, calmly replying, "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Hudson. I will stay here and provide everything you've requested, no matter how unreasonable it may be, because I believe that, in the end, truth and fairness will prevail." Robert smirked slightly, his eyes holding an undercurrent of mockery, but he didn't respond. He turned away, gesturing for Megan to come closer, and whispering something in her ear. Evelyn knew they were discussing ways to continue making things difficult for her, but she also knew that at this point there was no turning back. This was no longer just a personal matter, but a fight to protect the very core principles she had spent her life building. Evelyn stood there quietly, her head held high, silently preparing for the long battle ahead. Because now, she was not just fighting for herself, but for the thousands of others who silently endured injustices, the deep-rooted prejudices hidden beneath the mask of civility. In the moment when Robert turned to whisper something into Megan's ear, Evelyn could clearly sense that the situation was about to escalate. Her heart beat a little faster, her intuition telling her that Robert wouldn't stop until she either submitted or gave up. Robert turned back, his face wearing a fake seriousness, his cold eyes directed straight at Evelyn without hesitation, delivering a line that completely took her by surprise. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter, but after careful consideration, we cannot process this transaction for you at this time. Please step away from the counter to avoid disturbing other customers." Robert's words struck Evelyn like a harsh slap to her pride. She could feel the curious stares, the murmurs of the nearby customers all focused on her. Robert wasn't just denying a simple transaction. He was intentionally turning her into a troublemaker in front of everyone. "Mr. Hudson," Evelyn responded, trying to keep her voice calm but firm, "are you really going to deny my legitimate transaction based solely on unfounded suspicions?" Robert didn't answer immediately, only glancing discreetly toward the door before giving a subtle signal to the nearby security guard. Officer Brandon, the burly man in the dark blue security uniform, quickly stepped forward. His steps were firm, his expression stern, showing no sign of sympathy or respect. "Please step away from the counter," Officer Brandon said curtly, his authoritative tone cold and emotionless. Evelyn felt as if all the strength in her body was focused on maintaining her composure. She looked at Officer Brandon, her gaze resolute yet filled with disappointment. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm simply exercising my legitimate rights as a customer. Why should I leave?" Officer Brandon didn't respond to her question, simply taking another step closer, as if subtly threatening her. This action immediately drew the attention of all the customers and staff in the bank. Whispers began to spread throughout the space, and all eyes were now on Evelyn, Robert, and the security guard who was closing in on her. Robert stood there, silent, with a smug look on his face, as if to say to Evelyn that this was the consequence of opposing him: public embarrassment and humiliation before everyone. "I suggest you cooperate," Officer Brandon continued, his tone growing harsher. "We don't want to resort to stronger measures." Stronger measures. That phrase hit Evelyn deeply. She, who had spent her entire life building a bank based on human principles, was now being threatened by her own staff in front of customers. The prejudice and discrimination had clearly gone beyond what she could tolerate. Evelyn took a deep breath, regaining her composure. Her gaze was steady as she looked at Officer Brandon, then turned to Robert, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "I want you and everyone here to understand clearly that I haven't caused any problems. I'm simply asking Carter Trust Bank to honor its commitment to fairness. If you want to use force to make me leave, you're going against everything this bank stands for." The bank's atmosphere became so silent it was almost suffocating, all eyes now on Evelyn with a mixture of astonishment and respect. Robert frowned, the first time he seemed taken aback by Evelyn's strong and unwavering response. However, Robert quickly regained his usual cold demeanor. He took another step closer and subtly signaled to Officer Brandon again, as if challenging Evelyn to accept defeat before the power he controlled. "Mrs. Carter, I've made myself clear. This is the bank's security policy. If you don't cooperate, we will have to take further action." Evelyn no longer replied. She stood still, her head held high, staring straight into Robert's eyes, making it clear that she wasn't afraid. She knew this struggle wasn't just her personal fight anymore. It was a battle against discrimination, against the invisible biases lurking in every word and action of people like Robert Hudson. In that tense moment, Evelyn realized something important. She couldn't stop, she couldn't give up, because she knew that if she backed down today, that silence would be complicity in allowing injustice to continue and flourish. And in that moment when the limit was crossed, Evelyn understood clearly that she would do whatever it took to fight for and protect the values she had spent her entire life building, even if it meant paying any price. In that intense moment, Evelyn could clearly feel the curious and suspicious gazes of those around her directed at her. But instead of panicking or succumbing to the pressure that Robert had deliberately created, she felt a new strength beginning to rise within her. A strength of unwavering resolve and determination. Evelyn silently reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone. Every movement was deliberate, but firm. She switched to recording mode, aimed the camera directly at Robert Hudson and Officer Brandon, and began speaking in a clear, powerful voice. "I, Evelyn Carter, am standing at the Carter Trust Bank in Indianapolis. a place I once believed always treated every customer equally. But today, I am being refused a legitimate transaction by branch manager Robert Hudson, and he even called security to intimidate me. Robert was stunned by Evelyn's sudden action. His face quickly tightened, his eyes momentarily showing panic, but he quickly masked it with cold anger. "Miss Carter, what are you doing? I demand that you stop recording right now." Evelyn remained unshaken. She kept her phone steady, directing the camera at Robert, her voice growing even clearer and stronger. "Mr. Hudson, I am recording this as evidence. I want you to explain clearly to this camera, why am I, an elderly black woman, subjected to unreasonable requests and treated with clear discrimination, while white customers don't face similar issues?" Evelyn's words echoed throughout the bank, capturing the undivided attention of everyone present. Customers and employees stood silently, watching as the situation unfolded unexpectedly. Officer Brandon, confused, took a few steps back, no longer daring to move forward. Robert clenched his fists, trying to hide the growing confusion on his face. He struggled to maintain his composure, but his voice trembled slightly, losing control. "Miss Carter, please don't make things worse here. I've already told you this is just a security issue and has nothing to do with race or age." Evelyn shook her head, her voice filled with disappointment but still firm and clear. "You're lying, Mr. Hudson. If this were really a security issue, why were other white customers who came here to withdraw even larger amounts not questioned or asked for anything similar? Why am I the only one being treated this way?" Evelyn's sharp words made Robert freeze. Nearby, customers began whispering. Their gazes now turned suspiciously towards Robert. The situation had completely turned around. From trying to put Evelyn in a vulnerable position, Robert was now the one cornered. Without giving Robert a chance to react further, Evelyn aimed the camera at Officer Brandon, who was still standing awkwardly beside them, her voice resolute. "And you, Officer Brandon, I want you to explain why you were willing to intervene so forcefully with me when I did nothing wrong except demand fairness and respect from this bank." The security guard blinked, flustered, then lowered his head to avoid Evelyn's piercing gaze. He didn't respond, silently taking a step back, distancing himself from the situation that was clearly beyond his authority. Evelyn turned back to Robert, her voice calm but carrying an unshakable strength. "I won't stop recording, Mr. Hudson. I want all the staff and customers here to witness how Carter Trust Bank is treating a longtime customer simply because she is an elderly black woman with no apparent wealth or power." Robert went silent. For the first time in his career, he felt that he had lost control of the situation. His usual confidence shattered, piece by piece, in the face of Evelyn's bold resistance. And in that moment, Evelyn could clearly sense that she was no longer alone in this fight. The gazes from the customers were shifting from curiosity to sympathy, even anger at how the bank was treating her. Evelyn stood tall, unyielding to the pressure from Robert, Officer Brandon, or anyone else. She knew that her decisive action wasn't just a personal protest, but the collective voice of so many who had silently endured injustice. She was ready to do whatever it took to ensure the truth would never be hidden again. In the tense moment that enveloped the entire bank, as Robert fumbled to regain control of the situation, Evelyn lowered the phone, her calm yet sharp gaze fixed directly on the man standing before her. She knew this was the moment for the truth to speak. "Mr. Hudson," Evelyn began gently, but her voice rang clear like a bell in the silent space. "I think it's time I properly introduce myself, so that you and everyone here understand exactly what's happening." Robert furrowed his brow. a hint of confusion crossing his face, but he still tried to maintain a cold demeanor. "What is it you're trying to say, Mrs. Carter?" Evelyn kept her gaze steady, her voice now clear and authoritative, in stark contrast to the simple appearance she bore at that moment. "My name is Evelyn Carter. Not only am I a longtime customer, but I am also the founder and current CEO of Carter Trust Bank. I am the one who signed the decision to appoint you as the branch manager 3 years ago." Evelyn's words immediately plunged the bank into complete silence. Customers stared at her in shock, while the employees began to murmur, unable to contain their amazement. Megan, behind the counter, gasped in horror, dropping the stack of papers she was holding. Officer Brandon took a step back, lowering his head to avoid Evelyn's gaze, clearly shocked by this sudden revelation. But the strongest reaction came from Robert. The confidence he usually carried quickly evaporated. His face turned pale, and his eyes widened in terror. Robert stammered, struggling to speak, but his dry throat prevented him from getting the words out. You mean Mrs. Carter?" "Yes, Mr. Hudson," Evelyn continued, her gaze unwavering. "I am Evelyn Carter, the same person you shook hands with at the opening of this branch, the one you promised would be served equally and fairly. But what have you done today? You have treated me, and many others, with disrespect simply because of their appearance and skin color." Robert completely lost control. His hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to regain composure but failed. He looked at Evelyn as if facing the most vivid nightmare. "Mrs. Carter, I really didn't know it was you. Please understand. This is just a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job." "Misunderstanding?" Evelyn cut him off, her voice growing stronger, more resolute. "You call discriminating and humiliating an elderly black customer a misunderstanding? Do you really think I will accept such a shallow excuse?" The atmosphere in the bank grew heavier than ever. The customers who had been curious at first were now clearly angry, whispering indignantly. Evelyn looked around, speaking louder so everyone could hear. "I disguised myself as an ordinary customer today to witness firsthand whether this bank is truly upholding the promises it once made to the community. And it is with great regret that I must say the truth is deeply disappointing. Robert Hudson, you and your staff have not only violated the policy of fairness but also directly broken the trust that customers have placed in Carter Trust." At this point, Robert staggered back a few steps, his back hitting the counter behind him, as though he no longer had the strength to stand. All his false confidence had completely crumbled in the face of this bitter truth. I didn't mean to," Robert stammered, his voice completely devoid of the arrogance it once carried. Evelyn looked at him, her gaze both stern and sympathetic toward the rapid collapse of a man she had once had high expectations for. But she knew that now was not the time for forgiveness or pity, for the harm Robert had caused was too great to overlook easily. "Mr. Hudson, I will not let this end here," Evelyn said decisively. "You and everyone involved will be held fully accountable for what happened today. I will ensure that no one at Carter Trust Bank dares to violate the core principles of fairness and respect for others." Evelyn turned to the other customers and employees, raising her voice with authority but also sincerity. "I promise all of you here, I will not stay silent in the face of such wrongs. Anyone who is treated unfairly at Carter Trust from now on can contact me directly. I will do everything in my power to protect the rights and respect that all of you deserve." After speaking, Evelyn once again fixed her sharp gaze on Robert, who stood frozen, completely powerless in front of this shocking truth. In that moment, she understood more than ever that revealing her true identity was not just about exposing an individual's wrongdoing, but about making a bold statement for all those who had been discriminated against and looked down upon. That fairness is not a gift to be given, but an absolute right that they deserve to claim. In the clear, determined gaze of Evelyn, one could see the strength and resolve to fight for the values she had promised to the community. Values she would now fight with everything she had to restore. As Evelyn's powerful declarations reverberated through the tense atmosphere of the bank, Robert finally regained enough composure to speak in a trembling voice, desperately trying to find a way out for himself. "Mrs. Carter, I am truly sorry. Everything that happened, it was all just an unfortunate misunderstanding. We never intended to offend you or any other customer." Evelyn immediately raised her hand, cutting Robert off firmly. "A misunderstanding, Mr. Hudson. You call refusing my legitimate transaction, questioning me with insulting remarks, and calling security to intimidate an elderly black woman simply because of her appearance. A misunderstanding." Robert, flustered, tried to explain once again, but his voice began to falter. "No, I didn't mean it that way. I was just trying to follow the guidelines." "What guidelines are those, Mr. Hudson?" Evelyn interrupted again, her voice now cold yet authoritative. "What guidelines allow you to disregard and discriminate against customers based on age and race? I wrote the guidelines for this bank, and there's never been a clause that allows that to happen." The customers around them started murmuring more loudly, nodding in agreement with Evelyn's words. The tension in the air shifted to clear outrage. Robert noticed this shift, his face turning pale, his voice growing weaker. I beg you, Mrs. Carter, please believe me. This was not intentional. This is just my personal mistake. It has nothing to do with the bank." Evelyn stepped closer to Robert, her gaze sharp as if it could pierce his soul. "No, you're wrong, Mr. Hudson. This is intentional racial and age discrimination. You deliberately made it difficult for me, humiliated me so I would leave on my own, just because I don't fit the profile of the customers you prefer to serve." Robert fell silent, his ability to argue drained. His gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumped as if he had just experienced the most crushing defeat of his career. Evelyn scanned the room, turning her attention toward Megan and Officer Brandon, both of whom lowered their heads to avoid her piercing gaze. Evelyn spoke clearly, each word ringing with finality. "I want everyone here to hear this clearly. The racial and age discrimination I've witnessed today will never be tolerated in Carter Trust Bank again. Those involved in this shameful act, from Robert Hudson to Megan and Officer Brandon, all of you will be held accountable before the Board of Directors and our entire customer community." Megan quickly looked up, her eyes wide with panic, her lips trembling as if she was about to say something, but then fell silent under Evelyn's stern gaze. Officer Brandon, too, took a step back, his face filled with concern for the future of his career. Robert summoned all his courage, desperately pleading for one final chance, his voice filled with hopelessness. "Mrs. Carter, I know I was wrong, but please, give me a chance to make it right. I am truly sorry." Evelyn shook her head gently, her eyes both stern and filled with a hint of pity for the man she had once trusted. "A chance to make it right, Mr. Hudson? No, it's too late for that now. The damage you've caused today isn't just a personal wound for me, but a deep wound in the hearts of all those who have placed their trust in the fairness and respect of Carter Trust Bank. I cannot allow those who disregard the core values of this bank to continue working here." Robert stood motionless, seemingly devoid of any hope to cling to. All the confidence and arrogance he had once held had evaporated. Evelyn looked at him once more, this time her voice softer, but still unwavering. "I don't take any pleasure in doing this, Mr. Hudson, but this is my responsibility to protect the respect and fairness of our customers at Carter Trust Bank. I will immediately call an emergency meeting with the board of directors to address this issue thoroughly. Those responsible will face appropriate consequences." With those words, Evelyn turned and walked away, each step echoing in the absolute silence of the bank, like a firm declaration that she would never compromise or tolerate injustice. Robert stood frozen, watching Evelyn's retreating figure, his eyes filled with despair and shock at the consequences of his own actions. Now he understood that this confrontation was no longer just a misunderstanding. It had become an uncompromising battle, and he was the one who had failed miserably in that fight. And deep within her soul, Evelyn knew that today's confrontation was just the first step, but it was the most important one to reclaim the respect and fairness she had spent her entire life building. As soon as Evelyn turned to walk away, the sound of her shoes echoed through the absolute silence of the bank, like a final declaration to Robert and all the staff present. But after just a few steps, she suddenly stopped, turned around, and faced them all directly. Her voice rang out clear and resolute. "I want every employee here to hear this. Today, I will call an emergency meeting with the board of directors and senior management of Carter Trust to resolve this matter once and for all. There will be no tolerance for any discriminatory behavior in this bank." Each word Evelyn spoke was like a sharp verdict, causing all the employees at the Indianapolis branch to freeze in shock and fear. Panicked eyes turned towards Robert, who now stood motionless, his face ashen, unable to believe what was unfolding before him. Robert tried to speak again, but this time his voice had completely lost its strength. "Miss Carter, I beg you to give me another chance. I swear this will never happen again." Evelyn immediately shook her head, cutting him off with a cold but decisive look. "Mr. Hudson, I have made myself clear. Your chance ended the moment you chose to act in that discriminatory manner. You will never work at this bank again, not even for one more day." Evelyn's words sent a ripple of shock through the crowd of employees. Megan, standing behind the counter, trembled as she covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Officer Brandon lowered his head, feeling the weight of the consequences of his actions. The other employees exchanged uneasy glances, each wondering what the future held for them. But Evelyn didn't allow them to wonder for long. She raised her voice again, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the employees present. "I want everyone here to understand that anyone working under this roof at Carter Trust must absolutely adhere to the values of fairness, respect, and equality that we stand for. If anyone feels they cannot uphold these values, I strongly advise that person to leave voluntarily before they are forced to leave, like Mr. Hudson today." The air in the bank was as tense as a drawn bowstring, and no one dared to breathe too loudly. Robert, once a man of power and confidence, now stood silently as if stripped of everything, his power, his honor, and his career. Evelyn silently observed the reactions of the staff and customers, a mix of sorrow and determination rising within her. She never imagined she would have to make such a strong and decisive move against someone she had once trusted. But she knew that this action wasn't just about dealing with Robert personally. More importantly, it was a stern warning to all the other employees, a statement that she would never tolerate injustice and discrimination in the very house she had built. "I will personally oversee all changes from today onwards," Evelyn continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I want every employee here to remember, The reputation and existence of Carter Trust Bank is based on trust and absolute respect for every customer, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. This is a principle that cannot be changed. Robert bowed his head, no longer able to resist. He understood that it was over, and he had lost everything in that single moment of grave mistake. Some employees silently nodded in agreement with Evelyn, while others still trembled, fearful of what lay ahead. Evelyn finally turned and headed for the door, this time not stopping. As she passed the long line of faces with their heads bowed in silence, her gaze remained fixed ahead, a future she knew would be difficult, but absolutely necessary. She believed that the decision she made today would lay the foundation for real and lasting change at Carter Trust. The bank door closed behind Evelyn, but the pressure-filled silence within the branch lingered. The employees looked at each other with confusion and palpable unease. They knew that from this moment on, nothing at Carter Trust would ever be the same again. It was a truth they would have to accept, and something Evelyn was determined to make happen at any cost. Just before the door to the bank closed behind her, Evelyn suddenly stopped once again. She turned slowly, her unwavering gaze sweeping across the faces of the customers and employees present at the branch. Everyone was staring at Evelyn, waiting for her final words, the woman who just minutes before had been dismissed as an unknown customer. Evelyn's voice rang out calmly, but with immense authority, shattering the heavy silence. I want to emphasize one thing before I leave here. Carter Trust Bank will never accept discrimination in any form. Actions like what happened today will never be allowed to repeat, neither with me nor with anyone else. Her gaze now fixed directly on Robert Hudson, who was still standing frozen in the corner of the room, making it clear that this stern warning was directed straight at him and anyone else who might consider walking down a similar path. From this day forward, Evelyn continued, her words clear and sharp, there will be major and comprehensive changes at Carter Trust. I promise all our customers and employees here that we will rebuild an environment based on trust, absolute fairness, and sincere respect for each individual, no exceptions. Evelyn's declaration caused some employees to lower their heads in shame, while others looked at her with clear admiration. An elderly customer standing nearby nodded repeatedly, her face showing deep emotion from what she had just witnessed. Evelyn continued, her voice softer but still carrying the same power. I will never allow the human values of Carter Trust to be compromised by anyone's personal biases. We will implement mandatory training programs for all employees, focusing on the complete elimination of prejudice and discrimination. Anyone who cannot fully adhere to these principles will no longer have the opportunity to work at this bank. Robert felt as though he were crumbling, each word from Evelyn striking directly at the mistake he had just made, a grave error that no apology could erase. Evelyn paused for a moment, her gaze softening as she looked at the customers with a sincerity more palpable than ever before. I apologize to all our customers for making you witness this disgraceful event, but I also thank you, for your presence today is a valuable reminder of the responsibility I must continue to bear. I promise you that Carter Trust will change, and it will change starting today. As Evelyn finished speaking, there was a moment of silence in the bank, followed by the first applause coming from the customers, which gradually spread throughout the spacious room. This wasn't just applause. It was a deep agreement with the strong promises Evelyn had just made. Robert stood frozen, fully aware that his career at Carter Trust had ended in that very moment. Megan, standing behind the counter, had reddened eyes from regret. Officer Brandon quietly retreated into the corner, no longer holding the authority he had just minutes before. Everyone understood that the changes Evelyn had just announced would not be empty words, but a decisive turning point to protect the core human values of the bank. Evelyn glanced around one last time, offering a small smile to the customers who were applauding her, before she stepped toward the door. When the door closed behind her, Evelyn knew that from that moment on, Carter Trust would enter a new chapter. A chapter of courage, responsibility, and genuine respect for every customer who walked through its doors. Inside the bank, the echoes of Evelyn's powerful message still resonated, sinking deeply into the hearts of each employee and customer. They all knew that after today, Carter Trust would never be the same again. And they were certain that under Evelyn Carter's leadership, the core values of equality and respect would be fully restored, and stronger than ever. Just a few hours after Evelyn left the bank branch, news of the incident spread like wildfire within Carter Trust. Robert Hudson was immediately suspended, and not long after, the official termination letter was sent to him. A heavy silence fell over Robert as he packed up his belongings, avoiding the accusing glances of his colleagues. The career he had built over the years had now crumbled in an instant, leaving him with the harshest lesson of his life. At the same time, Megan and Officer Brandon received urgent summonses from the Human Resources Department. Evelyn had issued a clear directive. Both would have to undergo mandatory training on bias and discrimination, which would be conducted seriously under the strict supervision of senior leadership. For Megan, this was the first time she had to face the consequences of her thoughtless actions. The young woman realized that the seemingly harmless attitude she had displayed that day had pushed her to the brink of losing her fledgling career. Meanwhile, Officer Brandon couldn't avoid the deep sense of shame he felt. From someone who had always prided himself on the power and authority of his security uniform, he now had to bow his head and relearn the fundamental values of respect and equality, values he had forgotten when facing Evelyn that day. Evelyn didn't stop at handling those directly involved. She immediately implemented a series of comprehensive and decisive changes across the entire Carter Trust banking system. A new internal control system was set up, allowing customers to easily report any incidents of discrimination or disrespect. Each complaint was closely monitored, handled transparently and thoroughly, with direct involvement from senior leadership. Urgent meetings were held in the following days. Evelyn personally attended each session, her gaze always stern yet full of hope, as she reminded each branch manager and staff member, "I want each of you sitting here to understand that Carter Trust is not just a place for managing money. We are managing the trust and respect of our customers, things that are priceless, and we cannot afford to lose them ever again." Evelyn's powerful message quickly spread throughout the bank. Anti-bias and anti-discrimination training sessions became a mandatory standard at every branch nationwide, with the content carefully reviewed and approved by Evelyn herself. No one at Carter Trust dared to overlook these core values, as they understood that Evelyn would never forgive them if they made the same mistake again. Customers who had once felt neglected, discriminated against, or unfairly treated at the bank began to speak up more forcefully. They were empowered to report even the smallest wrongdoings. Evelyn personally monitored every single complaint, leaving no case unaddressed. She believed that this was the first step in rebuilding customer trust, something the bank had unintentionally lost long ago. In a short time, the atmosphere at Carter Trust branches began to shift noticeably. Staff members became more careful, more dedicated, and especially more aware of their personal responsibility toward each customer they served. Megan, after the mandatory training sessions, began to realize that the greatest value in the career she was pursuing wasn't the numbers in customer accounts, but the trust and respect every person walking into the bank deserved. As for Officer Brandon, he began to look at the customers coming into the bank with a completely different perspective. Not with doubt or prejudice, but with sincere respect and understanding. These changes, though stringent, gradually created a powerful ripple effect. Customers began returning to the bank, bringing with them a deeper trust in Evelyn Carter's promises and decisive actions. She was no longer standing alone in the battle against prejudice. Now, she had the strong support of all the employees and customers who believed in the new values she had bravely re-established. And deep within her soul, Evelyn felt that the harsh consequences she had just enforced were not for personal revenge, but to create a profound change, a revolutionary turning point in the culture and ethics of work at Carter Trust. A bank she had always dreamed of making a true symbol of trust, equality, and absolute respect for everyone, without exception. After the bold changes Evelyn implemented day by day, Carter Trust Bank began to show clear transformations. The tense, cold atmosphere that once existed gradually gave way to sincerity and warmth. Staff, from senior managers to tellers, understood that their responsibility was not only to serve, but to protect the trust and dignity of the customers, especially the elderly and vulnerable groups. Customers entering the bank were now greeted with friendly smiles, polite and attentive attitudes. Elderly clients in need of special assistance were prioritized more than ever. They no longer had to endure suspicious stares or be treated coldly. Those who had hesitated due to fears of discrimination now returned to Carter Trust with renewed confidence, carrying a sincere belief in the strong changes Evelyn had promised. On an ordinary morning, just like any other day, Evelyn revisited the Indianapolis branch, the scene of the tense confrontation. As she entered, she immediately noticed the difference in the atmosphere. Customers and staff were more friendly and natural. Transactions took place in a comfortable and respectful environment. Megan, who had once made a serious mistake, was now much more mature and professional. When she saw Evelyn, she gave a shy yet genuine smile, as if sending her a heartfelt thank you from deep within. Evelyn nodded in return, understanding that the young woman had truly learned a valuable lesson. Officer Brandon had also changed a great deal. He stood near the entrance of the bank, warmly greeting each customer with both politeness and friendliness, no longer showing any signs of intimidation or disrespect as he had before. When he saw Evelyn, Brandon quietly bowed his head in a gesture of deep respect and gratitude, as if he had been liberated from the invisible prejudice that had controlled him for so long. Evelyn stood silently for a moment, observing the positive changes unfolding before her. She knew that the fight against discrimination had never been easy, but the transformation she was witnessing at Carter Trust was the strongest proof that effort and determination would always be rewarded. Walking toward the center of the bank's expansive space, Evelyn turned to everyone and spoke in a soft but emotional voice. "I know the past days haven't been easy for any of us, but I also know that we've done something incredibly important. We've had the courage to face the truth, accept change, and commit to building a fair working environment that respects all customers, no matter who they are." Evelyn paused for a moment, then continued with a voice warmer than ever. "Everything that has happened has given us a great lesson in perseverance and responsibility. We have learned that real change can only occur when each of us has the courage to fight and never remain silent in the face of injustice, no matter how small it may seem." Her words were met with strong agreement from the customers and staff present. They clapped, not out of politeness, but because they understood and deeply felt the value in every word she said. Evelyn's gaze softened, and she continued speaking with all the sincerity and emotion in her heart. I believe that today's story is not only a lesson for Carter Trust, but also a message for everyone. Never let fear make us silent. Speak up, fight for what's right, because only then can we build a truly fair and livable society. Finishing her speech, Evelyn gave a small, proud smile, knowing that Carter Trust was now ready to enter a new chapter full of hope and strength. The human values she had once committed to were truly becoming a reality. Not just through beautiful words on paper, but through the actions, attitudes, and responsibilities of each individual standing here. Evelyn walked out of the bank, leaving behind a deep trust and genuine gratitude from everyone. She understood that the journey ahead would still be long, but as long as there were people brave enough to speak out against injustice, people who would never accept silence in the face of wrong, the future would always be full of hope. Because in the end, Evelyn Carter firmly believed that real change only happens when we have the courage to fight and never remain silent in the face of injustice. Evelyn Carter's story is not only a reminder of the importance of courage and responsibility, but also clear evidence that each of us can create significant change if we do not remain silent in the face of injustice. What about you? If you were Evelyn, how would you act in this situation? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. And don't forget to share this meaningful story with those around you, and subscribe to our channel to follow more inspiring stories in the future. Thank you for listening and joining us. We look forward to seeing you in the next stories.